Anyway, this is the Game Design Live Chat. I'm Carla Kopp. I'm a designer, developer, and publisher, and we are here with the truly amazing Isaac Shalev, who has designed so many games, including Chronosphere, Ravenous River, Pickpockets. I have a giant list over on this screen. But
Seikatsu. Tell the fans what they want to hear.
That one too. But also, one thing you're super good at is you're the co-author of the Building Blocks of the Tabletop Game Design book, which is an encyclopedia of mechanisms. Definitely not mechanics. It's always mechanisms. But you are also, I'm probably missing lots of things like that game you said. So what else do you do? Oh, you're on board games too.
Yeah.
You've been doing podcasts for your whole life.
It's true. Sometime back in 2013, the game industry was like, you know what we need more of? Like white guys. So Isaac, why don't you just do all the things? And so I got to design games and get on podcasts and do all kinds of fun stuff. And hopefully more and more people are getting to do that these days too. And I'm really excited to be part of that movement. But I got to design games with companies like AEG, which is an incredible opportunity that I got really early on. I was invited to a podcast that had been going for years and years before I showed up. So, talk about being born on third base. Podcast that had 6 or 7 years behind it before I was asked to join. And ultimately, Jeff Engelstein, the father of teaching game mechanisms, invited me to write a book with him about game mechanisms. So, my success has really been built on so many people who have come before, and I'm really, really grateful to that, and hope that everything I do is a way of inviting more people into gaming.
Mm-hmm. So I really think that what you do is that because when we met, you were super inviting, and it was great to meet you, and you were so welcoming.
Thank you.
And I think we're also a pretty good playtesting duo where we tell the real truths to people.
We did make a couple of people tear up, but I think we also comforted them afterwards, and that was important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you are definitely way better at the comforting than I am. Usually I'm just like, oh no, I should not have been honest. What do I do now? And we both just freak out, but you are way better at the emotions. So, the topic of today is, well, there's two topics actually, early stage design and designing for a specific audience. So, let's start with early stage design. So how do you really get started with this, or define what it is?
Yeah, it's funny that we put these two topics together, because in some ways early stage design can feel in tension with designing for an audience. But what I think of early stage design is when you have something, right? You have a mechanism or a theme or a concept or an inspiration, and there's something there, but you don't have the rest of it. You don't have a game around it. You don't have it matched up. You don't quite have the fun up on that platform with all the spotlights on it, right? And that's what you want a game to do, is what fun it delivers, and you've turned all the lights onto that. You've made it real easy for players to access that fun. So early stage design is there. And usually it's the part of the process where you put the game on a table even though it can't take off and land yet. You know what I mean? You can't start the game and then play the game and then finish the game and see who won, right? You're still going to sort of take off, and then it's going to crash 6 times, and you're going to erase some words on cards and write some new ones, or you're going to grab a bag of chips from somewhere and throw them on the table and be like, the yellow ones do this and the blue ones do that. Okay, let's take the next turn. It's that messy, exploratory, find out whether it's really fun phase. That's what I think of as early stage design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a hard part to be at the really early stages like that, and where you're putting something on the table and you're not sure if you can even finish it. So what are some good tactics, when you are putting it on the table, to get the best sort of playtesting feedback?
Well, I think at that stage, it's most of the feedback is the experience itself. Your design is still young enough that your own experience is still really helpful. In 2 or 3 months down the road, you're going to have a hard time playing the game and really knowing whether it's hitting, because it's going to be so old to you, and it's going to have all the baggage of all the previous versions. But in early stage design, your eyes are still, I think, your best tool for getting feedback. The second thing is that, and this I learned from Ignacy Trzewiczek, he says that when you're in an early stage in the game, try and get to the end, right? Try and make a game end by role-playing the parts that you haven't figured out yet. So if you have a mechanism, you're like, okay, I have the mechanism for how we're going to decide who goes first, and I have the mechanism for how like the actions are going to get resolved, but I have no idea how much anything costs, and I have no idea why you'd cash in for this contract, or those pieces. Just role play, right? So be like, okay, so now I pay 3 yellow and 2 green, and I get 6 victory points. Why? Because that's what the monkeys wanted. It was all the bananas. Great. Now I have this. And you just move the game to the next piece, right? It doesn't have to be balanced. It won't be balanced, so there's no point in trying for it. But it also, I think, draws out from you what you think is good about the game. Because that role play, that story that you tell, that's your vision, right? That's the part of you that's filling in the gaps that you haven't figured out how to make work in a game, but that you want the game to say. And it's worth saying that out loud. Right? It really helps you make the game you're trying to make.
I really like that, the whole like saying it out loud thing, because there's definitely a difference between like just thinking something and like saying it out loud, because like when you say something out loud, then you actually start to believe it. There's like some psychological difference or there.
I'm a talk out loud designer, and not just designer, but I mean, I regularly will talk out loud. I pace in my office and I speak to myself. I reason with myself out loud. And, it's good that I work alone because people often are disturbed by that or think you're disturbed. But it is how I kind of get through things, because once I articulate a problem, it's usually a lot easier to solve it. And so much of, for me, the work of design is defining the problem. And when it's hard to, and when you're not sure what it is, that really tells you, that you're too early to solve. Maybe just keep experimenting. Just keep trying stuff. You're in the brainstorming phase where there are no wrong answers. There's only things to discover. And by the way, that's, I think, what typifies early design the most, is later you're solving problems. Right? Later, you're like, I know what I want it to do, and it's not doing it, and how do I make it do it? In early design, you're like, I know this is cool, but, it's almost like getting dressed. Is this t-shirt cool with this jacket or with this belt or with, you try it with lots of things, and you see something, and you're like, oh, it's cooler this way. I didn't expect that it would go with the corduroy, but it does. How do I amp that up? How do I dress that up even further?
Mm-hmm. So you bring up like role playing. Do you usually like just role play like a generic kind of player in the early stages, or do you start bringing out like specific player types?
So I do less role play in the sense, I think what you're talking about is something that I do in later stages where you're trying to still sort of test on your own solo test. You're not ready to inflict this on others. Or maybe it's a little bit later and you're trying to see if certain strategies are broken or really effective or whatever it is. And so there you might assign a player a direction and be like, this player cares only about bananas. They're going hard into bananas. Everything they do is bananas. This player is always going to punch the other player in the face. If there are options to be, I'm actually talking about a different kind of role play. I'm talking about the role play of almost role playing the game rather than the players. The game, so let's take an example. Maybe it's clearer. Imagine if we were creating Ticket to Ride. Okay, so that's a game that most of us are probably familiar with. And imagine that we had figured out the part of the game where you want to fulfill tickets, but we haven't figured out how you get train cards into your hand yet. Okay, so what we might be saying is, okay, so I use these train cards to connect this route. And now what? Right now the game is broken because I don't have a selection mechanism. I don't have a way to get train tickets in my hand. So I just role play and I say, well, I'm gonna want to build the green route. So let's pretend I got 2 green cards out of my draw. because whatever mechanism we're going to use, I'm going to want the green card. So let's just assume that I got them. So I'm sort of role-playing the game. The game is going to provide me with some access to that, but I don't know what. There's another approach to this that is it's called a stub mechanism. So the idea is, I don't know what the real mechanism is going to be, but let me just plug something in that's super simple and that just does the thing. So, use this a lot in like resolution mechanisms, right? I don't know what the combat mech is going to be, but for now, we're each going to roll a d10 and whoever's higher wins, right? That's not going to make it to the end of your game, but it's going to get you past the combat and into the next phase, right? So it's going to give you what you need. And stub mechanisms are cool because they give you enough capability to test other things. So for example, that dumb D10 mechanism, well, I may have other things in my game that are buffs and debuffs, and I don't know exactly how they're going to work either, but I have a +2 and you have a -1 now. Right? I don't know how it's going to work, but I can almost mock it. I can mock it up in this stub mechanism. And later on, I'll figure out how to actually make that cool and make that interesting.
Mm-hmm. I never actually thought of it like that because, I'm a software designer, so like I've used stub like just things before where you just like you put in like just random words or nothing, and I use those all the time. But it sounds like a really interesting thing to use it in a game to make the whole like getting it to the table so much faster. Ananda had a question.
Well, no, I think I read an interesting anecdote about the design of Dominion, where the designers weren't sure how they were going to get players the cards to select. So they just put out piles of all the cards and said, just choose whatever you want. We're working on a different part of the game right now. And then they liked it and just kept it for the final game.
Yeah, that happened to me in a recent design. Actually, I think, Carla, you might have played this one, Fairy Village, where, the game, it's a city building game, and most of the effort in design early on was in figuring out how you're going to use cards in combination in your tableau to build your village. And we didn't really have a selection mechanism. And I just said, what would be cool? Remember in Spirium, you could put your worker between two cards and then like you would draft them. Why don't we just do that? Like, let's get rid of all the other things that were happening there. There was an auction, there were dollar amounts. Let's just do the drop a worker between two cards and then we'll draft from there. And that ended up staying in the game all the way through. It was so good. Like, it supported what we were trying to do perfectly. And then some special abilities started coming into that part of it. So there's a building that lets you place a person at the corner of 4 buildings. So you could draft out of 4 buildings, right? So it is really interesting how sometimes these stubs get a life of their own, which I think is great, because maybe you just didn't have a great idea for that, and one grew naturally out of this approach.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, especially I feel like you can build upon it like you did in that game. That's like so fascinating. David had a question. What kind of time limits do you put on playtesting in early game design, such as a game that doesn't have an end yet? How long should you let players play that game?
I think this really is it's sort of a social question more than a game design question. A lot of my early stage design I do solo, right? So I just throw the components on the table, or I do them with my design partner. If I'm co-designing the game, I for a long time worked with Matt Loomis, and we'd actually, he's in Chicago, I'm in Connecticut, and we'd spend weekends together. We'd like fly out to be able to do this kind of work where you just dump some components out on a table and try and assemble the game that you sort of had an idea for. In that environment, in that context, you keep doing it until you either find something that excites you and that you sort of keep going with, or until it's time to make dinner. That's the timeline. When you're doing it with other players, and especially if you've got that like early playtest group that you can make play your broken, half done, markered up, we're going to change the rules every other turn. If you've got that group, I think that you want to honor and protect and really look out for them. So as soon as sort of there's a diminishing returns in terms of their fun, you're starting to sense they're disengaging, you're done. You don't need the game to finish. You don't need, you're looking for something. And once they've grown bored of looking for it with you, end it and preserve them for a future session.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like for any playtest really, as soon as like the players start getting disinterested, just shut it down because you don't want to bore people enough that they never come back.
Yeah, and it's real easy to smell. I remember I was at Boston Fig, which is a festival of indie games, years ago, and I was working on this design called the Baker Street Irregulars, and it was this incredible thing because the first like 10 to 15 minutes, like players got what the game was, understood, like it was asking them to do, it was a reverse cards type of game, and this was like a year after Hanabi came out, so everyone was still very new to that notion. So it took them a few minutes to sort of get, oh, this is what the game is about, and the excitement curve did this. And then about 4 turns in, they were like, I don't know how to make the game advance. Like I'm stuck and I don't know what to do next. And right, the all the air went out of that game, and you could sense it. It was so easy to tell. The way people's faces looked, the way the phones came into hands more, the way that just people, their hands drooped. Right, the cards start drooping in your hand, and you just sensed it. And I didn't have the experience then to know that I'd gotten as much as I could out of this group, and they they soldiered on. But I didn't learn anything more, and they didn't have any more fun. So in a sense, it was a missed opportunity for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree that it's good to like realize when you're done. So I've actually not done a lot of early stage design. Most of my early stage is just staring at a spreadsheet. Have you always done the early stage like this, or were you also a spreadsheet person at one time?
Way back when I first was trying to design games, I designed them in the computer. And what I discovered is that I was usually wrong about what would work, and at a really basic level, and I think that I probably would be better at that today, right? So, 7 years later, I think I can construct sort of a working game much more quickly now. May not be fun, but it sort of would work. But I only assume that that's true. I don't know, because the thing that I learned most of all is games develop when they hit the table. And so my whole process is, how do I get this to the table as soon as possible, even if it's not everything, and even if it's not, I don't care. Put it on the table, make it a component. It's actually why I'm really struggling with the current crisis. I can't do that in Tabletop Simulator. All of that digital prototyping is really good for certain aspects of design, but for early stage design, I'm really having a hard time with it.
Yeah, it has to be like a very spatial or tile laying game for that to work. Like I've actually been doing like a little bit of early stage design where we're just like trying to fit the tiles together, and like Tabletop Simulator adds in like an extra like, oh, I can't put this thing where I want to put it. I'm trying, like, just everyone, I tried to put it there, and yeah.
Yeah, and there are cool ideas that might not even work ultimately in a real game, but that you might experiment with at your table, but that you can't in Tabletop Simulator. I mean, trying to experiment with dexterity or stacking mechanisms, just doesn't work. Or there are a lot of like, hey, let's just dump all this in a bag and then do something with it, that in TTS is just such a pain, but in real life is like the simplest thing. So I'm very concerned about the medium shaping the game itself. And so I'm hesitant to do the early stage in TTS. But I do want to let folks know there was a game, a Kickstarter, a long time back called Emperor's New Clothes. It was designed by Jonathan Liu, and who writes as Geek Dad. So more folks might know him under that name. And it was an interesting thing. The Kickstarter itself was sort of like a cool, like, are you in on the joke? Because the game was, everything was white box. It was like what you might get from a manufacturer before they give you the like print production. They give you like just all the components and their shapes and whatever, but print, with no print, it's just white. And there was a game in there kind of, but a large part of what the game did was tell you to tell me what the game does, right? So I play a card, the card is totally blank, and I say what the card does. And now the card does that, right? And somebody else might take it and also play it. And it's the same blank card as the 5 other blank cards in their hand, right? But it's not, because we named it and we said it did a thing. And that's all you need to do early stage design, is you just need the agreement to treat something different, and you can now prototype it. And that doesn't come through in TTS nearly as well, right? Because the bandwidth of our social communication with one another that makes that work doesn't work as well in TTS. And I miss that. And I think that Emperor's New Clothes, if you haven't had the chance to experience it, is something, you should look up the rules and try it at home, because of course the components are all just blank. So there's no problem in making it out of whatever you got lying around.
Mm-hmm. So do you have like a box or like a kit that you use for early stage design? Or like grab things?
I'm like looking to the side. I have I came across when I was living in New York what is it? It's like 10 or 12 drawer high set of candy drawers of the kind that you might find in like a bulk candy shop or like bulk seeds and nuts type of place. And they are just, every drawer is filled with a variety of components that, over the years I've kind of added on. I find myself coming back to sort of a familiar set. And I think I'm different than a lot of other designers who I've talked to about, in that I prefer to use the fancy components, right? A lot of designers are like, I just need some cubes and a few colors and a couple of blank cards. And I'm like, no, I need the acrylic gems and all the different colors as well as the cubes. And I really like to be able, even silly like things like, if I have a health bar in my game, I really want to have the acrylic heart to track it with. Because for me, those things bring more ideas to life. They're generative in a way that the blank components aren't. And I think that for a lot of other designers, the blank components maybe give them permission to overwrite them. But I really like when the game starts to take shape. I had a game where it was a rain-based game, like you're raining on fields, and I was using wooden meeple sheep because they look like clouds. Like if you don't think of them as sheep and you think of them as clouds, then they're clouds. And I don't know, that really helps me.
Well, I definitely like that too. What I use is like little mini erasers. They're super cheap, but like they're the exact, like they're super colorful and that thing that I need. But now I kind of feel like a hoarder because I have so many mini erasers.
Marcus Ross used those in a game called Bees that was published. That was the first time I'd seen them used, and I was like, that is so clever. That's exactly the kind of component that you should have around, but I've never actually gotten my hands on any.
Yeah, I was actually talking with Daniel Zayas at Longpack because like they make a bunch of mini erasers in China and they could probably source them and just coat them, and it would be a relatively cheap component. So people do that.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of designers out there who are using, a hobby like beads. Those like Triforce type, not Triforce, but you know what I mean? Like they have the propeller type of beads that you would normally string together into a necklace. And those are great because they don't roll away, and they come in colors, and they come in acrylics, they come in clear and solid, and they're small, so you can get a ton of them together. That's a really good one. But, to me, the question, when it comes to like what components should you use for all this stuff is it getting in the way of testing what you want, right? If it's too small, if it's too light, if it flies across the table, you want it to be real useful. And that's why I have, gone shopping at the Meeple Candy sort of and gotten all the stuff that feels and looks like it came out of a game. I've gotten all of, the Stonemeyer resource bins and whatever. It's for me that it inspires my creativity.
Are there any other places you go, like other than the Meeple Candy and which is a game crafter thing at cons? Where else have you gotten things before?
So Educational Insights is a great educator store, and you can get all kinds of stuff there, especially if you're looking for wood manipulables. They've got a lot of those, some plastic ones as well. So that's, and I always just like to look around. There are catalogs of those kinds. Oriental Trading is a pretty well-known one as well, where you can get cheap stuff. So those are mainly where I've gone around. I've gone to like the craft stores to try and find stuff, and I've actually found that a lot of the common stuff that people recommend doesn't work quite so well. So like the gems that people use, like the aquarium gems, like those translucent stones in different colors, they're real heavy, and you really can't use too many of them. I do use them for trackers, because they have a magnifying effect. So the problem with the track, right? You have a disc and you have a track, and then you put the disc over the number that's on the track, and then you can't see the number. But you don't want to put the number under the track, because first it's a referencing issue, like I'm looking at the disc and then I have to look down or up at the number, but also it's a space issue, right? Like I want to squeeze, I don't want to have to use so much space up to make the track readable. So that's where those work great, right? Because they're see-through and they're magnifying, so they do all the things you want them to do. So I will use them for that. But yeah, I found a lot of those hobby craft components not quite as well suited as something that's a little bit better that somebody else is using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I fly to conventions a lot, and anything that's heavy is just means I can carry less. Charlie had a question. What's a mechanism you discovered in writing your book that you want to incorporate in a future design?
So one of the things that we did when we wrote the book is that Jeff Engelstein and I split up the writing so that we were writing the mechanisms that we were most comfortable with. And Jeff's experience when it comes to war games is vast and much, much, much deeper than my own. So he talked about quite a few mechanisms involving initiative and movement and resolution that either I hadn't heard of or I hadn't really seen all the varieties with which it can be used. One of the ones that I always kind of turn back to and rely on more in testing than in maybe the final game is various tie-breaking methods. So, like priority tokens and how they move around. So, there's going to be a tie between us, but I have the priority token, so I break the tie, but now I lose the token. And who does it go to? And how maybe can you get the token through some other action? What happens if there were multiple players, so it's not just me and you? Is it clockwise from the token? All those kinds of tie-breaking and resolution mechanisms. If that's something you struggled with, take a look. There's some really good stuff in the book about that, and that really helped me a lot.
Do you tend to go to specific tie-breaking mechanisms, or most of the time I just do friendly ties?
Yeah, it depends on the game, right? So I've been working on some word games, and in word games, I almost always want ties to be friendly because word games have a certain hard edge to them, and usually what I'm trying to do in my word game design is make the word game that sort of is a tweak to the nose of like the hardcore Boggle and Scrabblers, and is really a fun game that folks who say I don't like word games actually really want to play. So there, you really want to smooth out all of those catches, all of those sharp points where somebody's like, oh, I thought I had a really cool thing, but now it's a tie and we're both screwed, right? So I go friendly there. What I find, though, is that there are lots of times when you can't friendly tie, when the tie is not about scoring, but about priority. Who gets to act first? You can't friendly that. Or you can, like I cut, you choose is kind of a way to friendly that. So you say, okay, the two of you are tied and you are both supposed to select from, this set of things. So one person gets to, to divide the lot and another person gets to choose is kind of a way to friendly that, because the incentive of the divider is to divide things perfectly evenly, right? To not have any excess on either side. So that's a way to think about, I guess, a friendly tie. The other place that I think that friendly ties are challenging is you sometimes need to have a winner because there's some other outcome that depends on this. So it's not necessarily who's going to like sort of get a bonus or not, but it's like, oh, and also whoever's ahead on that track, that decides turn order, or that decides this other thing. And so, you know, sometimes that just needs a resolution. It needs to have an answer. And I actually hate tiebreakers for scoring in the end. Like, my feeling is, I'm not quite, so Uwe Rosenberg famously doesn't include tiebreakers for any of his games. So if you play Agricola and you played for 3.5 hours and you ended up tied, it's a tie. There's no tiebreaker. And he's right. He's 100% right about this. And the reason that he's right is because the game doesn't measure anything that is granular or like able to really capture that anyone was better or worse by a fraction of a victory point. It's not relevant in 3.5 hours of play and scores in the 40s. That, you know what I mean? It's just, it makes no sense. So I appreciate that. I always want one tiebreaker that is always going to be decisive. So in Seikatsu, the tiebreaker is reverse turn order. The player who goes last essentially has a slight disadvantage, really, really tiny, so we're essentially giving them a half a point. If it's tied, they win, right? And that's awesome because it's clean and there's no argument about it and everyone knows up front what it's going to be. And also you can't do anything about it. It's not like it shifts your strategy. Oh, I'm gonna you know, prefer to score birds over flowers because birds also have the tiebreaker. I find that a lot of times those decisions to like make that resource more valuable than the other influence players much more strongly than it should. It warps how players act. They don't act rationally about that resource. They don't recognize that it's just worth a half a point more. It's not that big a deal. So I, in the interest of finding a decisive winner, you've now reshaped everyone's actions, and I don't like that. So one tiebreaker, no arguments, you know up front what it's going to be, clean.
Yeah, I really agree with that. For a while, I was doing no tiebreaker, and well, I work with Dan Letzring for Galactic Raptor, and he's one of those there has to be 3 tiebreakers kind of person. And I'm like, you know, we played a game. That's why we played. We didn't play to win. So now I've started putting in like there's like a legit tiebreaker, and then the next one is just completely random. Like I have a one where it's about cats. So if you're still tied, then the last person who touched a cat gets it. Like,
and then there's a meta game when you play in a house where there's a cat, right? So everyone's passing that cat around or trying to touch the cat, and that can be fun. I mean, you know, there are some great trolls in tiebreakers. I think the very best one belongs to Dan Kassar. At the end of Arboretum, if you are tied, you have to plant trees. And 10 years later, whoever's tree is the tallest is the winner.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite one ever because, like, if you still remember it after 10 years, like, I mean, you deserve to win, I guess.
I guess it meant enough to you, right, that I would have conceded up front. I would have been like, no, that's cool. This is your win. That's fine. Yeah, look, short games, right, the tiebreaker is play again, right? If a game takes 10 minutes to play, then just play again. I think it's something that designers should be careful about because it's one of those things that tiebreakers don't fix a problem, right? They spackle over something unsightly. That's really all they're doing. If your game needs tiebreakers, it's because you're getting a lot of ties, which means that your game is not enabling players to demonstrate mastery and to create a spread, right? So I think this was a challenge with Between Two Cities. It was a very ambitious game that ran into this problem because in Between Two Cities, you are scoring 2 different cities that you build each one cooperatively with the player to your right and the player to your left. And your score is the lower scoring of your 2 cities. Now, inevitably, because of sort of the merry-go-round nature of this, it generates more ties, right? So the game has a list of, like, I think 6 or 7 different tiebreakers. And I gotta say, you know, you get down to tiebreaker 5 and you're like, this isn't meaningful. You didn't play better than me and I didn't play better than you. This is essentially a random, we could have just flipped a coin, right, if we really needed there to be a victor. from a development perspective, this is the opposite of early stage design, right? But from a development perspective, you look at that and you say, there's a problem with the game. It's not allowing enough separation. We need to fix that, right? Rather than create tiebreaker rules that spackle over it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And yeah, between two cities, like it takes so long to figure out the different tiebreakers, and at that point, like your scoring shouldn't like figuring out the winner shouldn't take longer than like a round of the game.
Well, and it's also the case that players don't know what the whole list of tiebreakers was in advance, and so then they can feel a little cheated because they're like, well, I wasn't going to hold up the whole game so that I could look up the list of 7 tiebreakers, but now I lost, so maybe I should have, right? And so it's incentivizing some bad table behavior too, right? It's incentivizing dragging the game down into the rule book, which if your game is doing that, unless it's War of the Ring, you're making a mistake.
Drew had a question. Do you ever have issues with adjusting game difficulties, dialing up or down the challenge? If so, how do you resolve them?
Okay, so I think in co-ops and in competitive games, this is a really different question. I'm actually curious which Drew had in mind. So, Drew, if you're still with us and you can clarify, I would love to know that. But in cooperative games, usually you build a challenge system that has inherent in it the ability to sort of ramp it up or down. So it's like, oh, do you draw 2 enemy cards at the end of the turn or 3 enemy cards at the end of the turn, right? So there's some natural forward planning. What's tricky is that often those systems are coupled, right? So it's not just one thing. It's, you're going to draw 3 enemy cards, but those 3 enemy cards are going to apply to 5 different enemy figures on the board. And if there are 5 of them, then that's huge. But if there's 4 of them, somehow that's a lot less bad, right? Like you sometimes get this big chunkiness in the impact of that. And those problems are very hard to solve, right? Like those problems are math problems fundamentally. How do you smooth those curves? How do you smooth them without making the mechanism itself really bulky? So that can be hard. And you can't really uncouple the mechanisms because that's what makes the game work, right? So like, so if you played,
if you play, what I was asking about?
Right, he said yes. That's what I was asking about, but I don't know at 8:38 p.m. what exactly I was saying, so I'm not sure if it was co-op or competitive. Well, so if you played like Through the Desert. Forbidden Desert, sorry. Forbidden Desert, Matt Leacock, right? So what that game does is you're running around a 5x5 grid, you're trying to get to tiles, flip them over, and recover things on the other side of the tiles, but the problem is that there's a sandstorm that adds sand tiles on top, and you can't flip over tiles if they've got sand on top of them or too much sand on top of them. And the challenge mechanism has 2 elements. One is you're flipping cards out of the deck and it's pushing the sandstorm around and adding more of those sand tiles. And there's another element where you're drawing cards, and if sometimes you got to drink water comes up, and when you run out of water, you're dead. These mechanisms are interconnected because the only way to get water back is to flip over specific tiles on the board that have wells, and that allows you to refill some of your water. But of course, if those are the tiles that are getting sand stacked on them, then you've just created this really tight and difficult loop where the game just gets harder and harder, and your fuse gets shorter and shorter in a looped fashion. And so, Leacock is brilliant, so he knows how to handle that problem. He created more than one well, right? So the chances of both of them getting pounded is relatively low. And he created a couple of special cards that prevent you from losing water or that allow you to gain water separately. So he softens sort of the blow and rounds it out. And that's sort of what you're trying to do. But he doesn't add some new system, right? There's not some third system to deal with this. It's all within the same system. It's all folded back onto itself. Great co-op games, I think, constantly are folding all the effects back on themselves, and you have this very careful balance. But Drew wanted to hear about competitive games and how do you deal with challenge. So the part of the question here, I think, is how do you make a game not too hard to learn and play, rather than, right, because in a competitive game, the challenge should come from the other players and their strategies versus yours, not necessarily that they are holding you back, but that you're measuring yourself to them. And the game should be clearer about how to achieve the goals that you want it to achieve, right? That you want mechanisms that are not too obtuse, right? The more you obfuscate what a mechanism does and why it helps you, the more the game feels like a random walk. You're like, well, should I draw these cards? This is very common, by the way, in games where like you can choose 2 rewards. You can either choose to get more gold or you can draw from the special abilities deck, right? And it's like the first time players play, they just take the gold, right? Because they don't know what's in the special abilities deck, and they don't know if it's like the way to win or not, and they're just like, I don't know, there's enough going on in this game, just give me the gold, right? So that's one thing to be careful about, is to help players understand what mechanisms are likely to produce for them, give them a sense of why those things are good. But ultimately, look, if you want to make a game that has some depth, it needs to have some discovery. Race for the Galaxy is a game that, frankly, is too hard to learn to play because of iconography, not because of anything else, but has a tremendous amount of hidden combinations and depth and interest. But when you sit down to play, when you sort of first have that moment of like, okay, we're playing this game, it's relatively clear that like, oh, so you're either going to make a trading engine and consume things in order to score your points, right? And you're going to score sort of on that trade, or you're going to sort of score your points on exploring and conquering, right, and taking new planets. So that to me is a great example of how to deal with the complexity or difficulty of the game, which is, even if I don't know exactly how to maximize those paths, I know those paths exist. It's relatively clear that there are 2 paths or 3 paths, and now I'm trying to figure out how to go down them best. So I hope that, Drew, helps answer what you're talking about. I mean, in terms of dialing up and dialing down, honestly, the answer to both is take things out. Nearly all of those problems are clarity problems more than balance problems, I think. And when they're balance problems, usually the best way to resolve them is take out the thing that's imbalancing it, unless it absolutely is the thing that makes the game. And if it's the thing that makes the game, take out everything else.
So,
Thanks. I think that.
okay, well, thank you, Drew, for that. Because I actually I enjoyed the co-op part, because co-ops are the part of game design that I had just not truly figured out yet. They're an enigma.
I still have one on my table right now. That's it's connected to an Atari IP, and it's like a dream come true to work on this Atari game that I played as a kid, and that, you know, it's just super cool that I get to do it. And then also horrible because it's like, you know, 90% of the time that you're making any creative thing, it sucks, right? Like most of the time in the making, it's horrible, and you're like, why am I doing such a bad job on this awesome thing that I love? Why am I, you know? And it's like, I am spray painting the Mona Lisa. What is wrong with me? And when it's a co-op, it's even worse because you do so much more solo testing, right? Because you can. So I have so many more hours logged on this game than I would normally have. Yeah, I'm with you, Carl. I haven't solved it yet. Although there's a fantastic book. I want to plug this. It's not my book. It's an incredible book. It's by Shannon Appelkline and Chris, I want to say Anderson, and it is called Meeples Together. And it is the very best book I have ever read on designing a specific genre of game, and it's for co-op games. So everyone out there, if you want to design co-op games, Meeples Together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll second that. I haven't finished reading it, but it's definitely given me like a number of like helpful hints where I'm just like, I have to stop reading because I have to go work on the design right now while it's like still in my head.
Right. It's very much read a chapter on Sunday and put it in your game Sunday evening.
Yeah. So we actually had like the second topic for this, which was designing for an audience. Can you tell us about some of the different kinds of audience types?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the Atari thing is kind of a good example because this is an IP game, so it's a license that I was given, right, and told you need to make a game for this. And when you do that, you're making a game for a very well-defined audience. You don't have to define the audience yourself because you know it, right? You know that you're designing for fans of this IP. And that's very, very helpful. And you really actually need to spend some time, even though you sort of know who the audience is, you actually need to spend some time naming it, right? Talking and figuring out what did that audience love about the IP? Who are they? Not just as gamers, but who are they as people? Where are they? Which stages of life are they in? What is the type of customer who's going to see that game as they walk into a shop or out of a shop and be like, yep, I'm going to grab that, so that you can design a game that meets their expectations, right? So that they feel like they got to re-experience the IP, but also got to see it in a new way. You can't just recreate the experience. You have to also reinterpret it and freshen it. But also that you meet them where they are as gamers. So, in the case of Atari, most Atari gamers are over 40 years old. Many of them are not board gamers, core hobby board gamers. And so you need to design mechanisms that speak to that audience, right? So, we made a different game in this line that it uses mechanisms that you'd expect to find in like a classic card game, because we know that the audience is going to have a lot of familiarity with that, but now they're going to get to see sort of a modern design twist on a classic card game in an IP that they love, right? And that sort of recalls playing that IP in some way. So that's sort of what you're trying to do. When you're not in an IP situation, it's even harder because who is the audience? A lot of us are not inspired by, I really want to design a game for an 11-year-old who loves dinosaurs, right? Like that's not where we're coming from. We're coming from, I think this thing is super cool and I want to design it, especially if it's thematic, but even if it's mechanical, right? Where you're like, wow, this is a super cool mechanism. I really want to make this shine. I really think there's something interesting here. That's about us. That's not about an audience, right? And so somewhere your art has to become product, right? Somewhere you have to say, well, who wants this? And what are they like, right? What else would they like about this? We just went through a process. I was designing a game with Raf Koster, and the game had started off as this very abstract, black and white stones, Othello, Go, that sort of family of games. And we actually ended up, getting it signed with that theme. But as we worked with the publisher was like, there's audiences that like this, but they're being well served right now, actually, right? And there's quite a few games that have come out that are doing this really well. And we actually think there's a more fun element to what you've made, right? A less cogitative and sort of thinky element, and actually a more fluid element. And people who kind of want turns where you grab a bunch of stuff, you drop them down in a couple of places, you play a card, you go, bam, I score 5, right? Like that seems to be what the game is about. So let's theme it up, right? Let's add some flavor to it that makes it support that. And all of a sudden you're like, well, if that's the game, then these 3 cards should change, right? Because they don't support that, right? So you do want to find and name your audience early. If you're not self-publishing, you also need to be prepared for a publisher maybe having a different idea about who your audience is. They're right a lot of times, by the way, right? Because like we as designers, we don't necessarily have a special expertise in knowing those audiences in quite the same way. So we mess up a lot. Like sometimes you'll make a game and you'll be like, oh yeah, there's a $40 product for this audience. And then like a publisher will be like, there's a $20 product for this audience that does what you're doing here, but it's not this. So when you're designing for specific audiences, what I recommend first off is find publishers who are making games for that audience. And don't do it by like being like, oh, what games do they make? Look at the publisher themselves, right? Go to their website and see who it's speaking to, right? So, Blue Orange, for example, makes some games that, gamers and hobbyists love, and they're fantastic. But you can't go to Blue Orange's site without walking away with the impression that they make games for 6 to 11-year-olds, right? Like that's what they're about. And I think that can help you sort of understand how to make like a Rainier Knizia, Through the Desert game into Blue Lagoon, right? Like that transformation essentially is exactly what we're talking about. How do you take this and target it towards the audience? So Through the Desert, thinky, abstract, hard, unforgiving, and AP prone. But if you make one simple change and say, oh, you know what? Instead of laying down 2 things per turn, you lay down 1 thing per turn, and the game becomes 75% easier to play, right? So that's what you're looking for. You're not trying to necessarily change the whole game. You're trying to find the places where the audience is struggling and make those easier, or find the places where the audience wants more. I mean, I pitched a game to Madigo, trying to extend what's the big pirate game where you're building the pirate ships and you go out and fight each other. It has that incredible cover that with the scope that Josh Capel did. It doesn't matter. It's a big pirate game, and we had sort of developed a like Liar's Dice based lighter version. It was sort of like the 45-minute version of this pirate game, and they played it and they were like, where's the rest of the game? Like this is a cool resolution mechanism that you've called a game, because our audience wants more than this. They need more chew. And we were sort of trying to do well, what if it's the card, it's the, this game, the dice game. And they're like, nah, I mean, maybe some other publisher wants that, but our audience is not looking for that.
Oh, that is some really great information. So have you ever had a time where you thought you were designing towards
Merchants and Marauders? Sorry. Sorry, Carla.
Yes. Oh.
Sorry, I totally threw up. Was there ever a time that I was designing for
a particular audience, and then you had to like change that up, or you were forced to change it?
Yeah. So I remember pitching a game to kids' table board games because I had this really it was called Rainbow Safari. And it was a kid's game, right? And you were trying to get from one end of the safari to the other by matching colors and types of animals. And it was sort of a tiling, what I thought was a simple, kind of kids game that would work really well for them. And I pitched to them on the balcony of Gen Con, right outside the CGE room. We were literally, because there's nowhere to pitch in Gen Con if you don't have like a place or whatever, so we're on the floor. And I was like, this is great. Like, it's a kid game that we're like getting on the floor and playing, and it's going to be perfect, right? And like 5 minutes in, Helena Capel turns to me, and she's still thinking about her move. And she's like, this is not a kid's game. I mean, let's keep playing a little because maybe it's still something, but it's not a kid's game. It was so much more analytical than I thought it would be. And in playtesting, part of the problem is, right, you playtest and you set people up for something, right? And so you set people up for, it's this light, fun game, and you have light, fun graphics on it, and you bring it out when you think the mood is right for that game. And so people play it like in a very casual fashion, and in some ways treat it a little bit like, it's a kid game. Okay, we're not going to think about it too hard. And then somebody plays it, and you're like, that doesn't work at all. And I never solved that game, by the way. I have ideas. It's probably not a kid's game, but yeah, that's actually some of the most valuable feedback, and I think it's why you want to put your game down in front of a lot of different types of players. And it's why, and as I've learned, you want to step 3 steps back from the table, right? Like, you don't want to play when you play test. Really, you don't want to play when you play test. I know there's some designers who really do and really believe in it. Some great designers. Bruno Faiduti comes to mind as someone who insists on playing in all his play tests. But for me, man, I just need to take 3 steps back and not shape the experience, or because I'm such a, I don't know, maybe I'm just a people pleaser, but like I want to tell the story and bring people into it and get them to like buy in. So I make an experience that the game doesn't have in the box.
Yeah.
And then I can't learn anything about what the game actually is.
Yeah, that is super interesting. Well, especially with the kids game, because like how you framed it by telling people it's a kids game, so they played it as if it was a kids game, so you got like very specific feedback. But like if you just don't tell somebody what kind of game it is, and then at the end ask these questions, you can get a lot of like just really interesting feedback. And I also suggest the whole like don't play during a play test, because like, well, like there's all these things that can happen. Like if you play first, everyone will follow you because you're the designer, so you have like completely wrecked it from turn one. But also like you have to like, I tend to play my games more than anyone else, so I know the right move more than anyone. So like I will also purposely make bad moves, but then people follow the bad moves. So now we are like in this weird place for the play test. And also it's just real hard to even like pay attention. Like,
yeah, but I think there's also that it's certainly hard to pay attention for sure. I also find that you have to sometimes make the bad move, right? Because if you make all the good moves, it doesn't work, right? I have congenital difficulties with doing that, though, because then I'm not playing the game. I'm role-playing someone playing the game. And I'm not a good enough actor to pull that off, right? In other words, everyone else is now playing a game with someone who is role-playing a game. They're not playing a game. They're, you know what I mean? So it's like a weird, observer effect kind of situation where, you've played a game where you felt like it wasn't a game. For example, like the couple that won't like bash each other in a game that's about bashing each other. So you've been in that game, and that's sort of like the same feeling, right? Because you're like, well, we're going through these motions, but this isn't a real game. This is like this weird, kabuki theater that we're doing right now because they're like having their marriage out in front of us, so it's the same sort of thing. As a designer, I'm like trying to make mistakes so that I don't dominate the game, because that is not helpful for me to learn that I can win. But then everyone, I'm 3 steps away from the table.
yeah. Well, I know that I've learned like maybe just have somebody else teach the game, and then you'll get even better feedback.
Yeah, teaching is another big one. And some folks don't write rule books till very late, and so they really sort of have to teach the game. And I've always been a designer that tends to write rules as just a way of remembering what I'm doing, as a way of tracking revisions, as a way of working out. Like if I can't explain a mechanism well in writing, then I know there's something wrong with it. Even if it works in play, I know really it's too complicated. I know really it won't work in real life. But they're not really rules that are ready for somebody to learn a game from. And I have over time learned that the phase from when you think you finished designing and you wrote complete rules to the phase in which your game is done is long, and one of actually the most exciting and interesting parts of design, where real cool stuff happens, because you have to let go, and people play your game from your rules. And yeah, maybe your rules, whatever, but you see so much more. I am so jealous of Matt Leacock and his ability to design solely based on remote feedback. So folks may be aware, but the way that he works is, he sends out his prototypes and people record themselves on video playing the game. And then he watches and takes notes, extensive, detailed, time-logged notes on what he's seeing on people's experience. And I'm so jealous because I can't get 30, gaming groups to do that for my game. I can barely get 2 to do it for my game. But I think it's a really strong, smart way to do game design. I wish I could do it more.
Yeah. And I think it'll be like all that more important in this next year to do it that way, because like we won't be able to.
Yeah, and I think it's part of also sort of the professionalizing of game design that's happening, because some of this stuff is easier to do for some designers because they already have some recognition, credibility, fan base, etc. But also some of it's easier to do in collectives, right? In design agencies and groups, because you just, if it's me and 4 people who have been in the industry for 4 or 5 years, it's all of our networks multiplied, and it's all of our friends multiplied. So, you're going to have more opportunities, and I think that's part of a trend in the industry that we're grappling with. Carla, is your audio back, or should I just fill more time?
Sorry, I'm using another computer, and there's headphones attached to it that somebody else is using. Sorry.
No worries.
Anyway, so it's to the end of it anyway. Where can people find you online?
The best place to find me online is at kindfortress.com. That's where you can read my design blog. That's where you can download my print and play games. And that's also where you can find all my other ways to connect. Subscribe to my mailing list, back my Patreon. It's got 2 backers. We're making progress. But no, that's sort of my hub. If you want to chat, if you want to bounce questions, if you want to talk, at Kind Fortress on Twitter is mainly where I'm at. I also like to hang out in the Board and Card Game Designer Guild, so designers on Facebook. You can also find me there. Listen to On Board Games. I only host it intermittently these days, but it's still a real good show. OnBoardGames.net.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. You were amazing as always, and I hope everyone has a great night.